Welcome to Melody Makers, where we discuss arranging and composing and meet the real melody makers behind the music of Melody's traditional music, folkharp.com, and Afghan press music for the harp. I'm Gretchen Monson, harpist, pianist, organist, and arranger, and your host for today. In today's episode, we have two special guests with us. Dan Reiter was principal cellist with the Oakland Symphony for many years. It was there he met his wife, harpist Natalie Cox. Dan writes and transcribes music for both solo harp and mixed duos and trios of harp with flute and cello. Before we chat with Dan, let's get a taste of his delightful work. This is Dan and Natalie playing Arpeggiata Meditation. Dan, how are you doing today?
Hi, Gretchen. I'm just fine this morning.
What do you remember about the first time you heard or saw a harp?
Let's see now. I was in Cincinnati Conservatory of Music. There was a harpist there, Elaine Humphreys, in fact. You might know her. I had a little bit of a crush on her back then. But nothing came of that. But we were good friends. She was beginning, actually, and I was interested immediately to see how would cello and harp play music together. So I was looking for various things that would work. And the first thing I came up with was, and this wasn't an arrangement, but it was the Schumann's 5 pieces in folk style for piano and cello. One of the movements in particular, which called Nicht Schnell, very beautiful, and it had a very natural harp part to it. You know, I would never ask a harp player to try to sound like a piano, but, you know, that's what I always look for, even today. And that worked somewhat well. You know, she still had some trouble with it at the time, even though she became an incredible harpist. She's amazing. But I think she had only been playing for a year at the time. At any rate, that piece, oddly enough, it waited maybe 40 years before I decided to really do an arrangement for cello and harp in a manner that is more agreeable to the harp. You know, this was after, you know, decades of changing my horizons about what's acceptable, how original do you have to be, how beyond the page can you go, all these questions, is less more, and when and why. So actually, I do have an arrangement of that Schumann piece ready to go. Lovely piece.
Fantastic. That's wonderful. And so what path did you follow to the master of your instrument? Because you play cello, and then do you play anything else?
Well, I do play piano. I started out on piano. Interestingly enough, when I was at the conservatory, I don't know if it was in my second year, it's hard to remember, but I did take a semester of harp. I just wanted to learn it. And I remember Pazzoli #1. I remember if it seemed very logical what to do. She hardly had to tell me anything. I forget who it was. Natalie thinks it was Malone, who was teaching there at the time in the 70s. But I don't really remember. You know, it's all a blur to me. But the path to arranging started probably the influence of friends that I had in high school who were taking pieces of Bach or Mozart, like the piano and violin sonatas, and playing them for clarinet, cello, doing the piano part, and the violin doing, you know, the violin part. We did things like that all the time, and playing at bars and playing in the street. And it was a lot of fun. But when I got home from Cincinnati, the conservatory, then my first wife, who played violin, we went down to Mexico to see if we can get into an orchestra in Guadalajara. We had just heard that there was an orchestra there. We were crazy hippies at the time. We literally had a VW hippie bus, and we drove down there, and they took us into the orchestra right away. And they were pretty good. This was the Autonoma University Orchestra. They did touring. And down there, I just practiced like crazy. You know, there was nothing else to do but fine-tune my art. But there was a harpist down there who was very good. They had a lot of gringos, Americans, in that orchestra, just like myself. And I did an arrangement of the Bach Toccata and Fugue for harp, clarinet, violin, and cello. Now, the harp player said, I can play the whole thing by myself, which, yes, I've learned they certainly can. I've heard Joel Andrews do it and many do it, and it's fantastic. But my interest then was in role playing. You know, what is the best way to lay out the parts for everybody to have something to do that makes sense so that everybody has something to do? So that was, I think, one of the earliest harp arrangements I actually did. So we came home from that orchestra. Then I played in the street with an oboe, a flutist, and myself. I just was walking around San Francisco and I saw these musicians playing on a street corner, and I just went up to them. I said, if you need a cellist to sub for your friend here, you know, I'm very interested. It turned out to be a great way to make money. And it was also the gateway to the need to do arrangements like Beethoven symphonies, Rossini overtures, Liszt Hungarian dances, just wild and crazy stuff, because that brought in the crowds and money. I think that was the only time I really did arranging to earn a living, was playing in the street. Because later on, when I did, you know, meet Natalie and form my Pacific Arts trio, it was more about the art. In fact, I wasn't selling anything back then. Everything that I'm selling now through Afghan Press is mostly the work that I did, you know, back in the 80s, when my Pacific Arts trio with Angela Corregalos on flute, Natalie, of course, my beautiful wife on harp. And we did, concert material. Actually, how we got together was really interesting. The flutist had heard that I had written something for 3 cellos and percussion, and she heard it during the Sound Spectrum series of Oakland Symphony. It was a contemporary music festival. So she came up to me and said, "Would you write a piece for flute?" And I said, "Okay, let me think about it." So I decided to make it for flute and harp. And this was a huge undertaking, and it took me almost a year to do it. And that request, I think, made me dig the deepest, because this was composition, not arranging. And even though I had wanted to be a composer, that's a much harder mountain to climb. Of course, she paid me for that commission with 1 baklava, which is the best payment ever. And that piece was involved with suggesting Indian music, shakuhachi and koto, sarod and tabla, gypsy violin and cymbalum. I was doing all of that kind of a fantasy Silk Road from another planet, if you will, type of thing. At any rate, it was still one of my best pieces ever, and I'm very proud of it. There's some recordings on YouTube, and it is being sold. It's not an easy piece. It's quite difficult, but, there's some very tricky rhythms, to get the Indian technique section. You can hear the tabla going a mile a minute. Of course, the harp was the ideal combination of a tabla and a tambura. Tambura being the background drone instrument, but giving rhythm. And of course, with a harmonic language that was, I wouldn't say ultra contemporary, but it was not pop. It was a new language that I was inventing based on shape. And this is where all my compositions have driven from. I didn't want to write anything that was based on 1-4-5-1 or any traditional harmony. So I invented a new way of thinking about music. I call it shape theory, where certain intervals are preferred or expanded. In a lot of my other classical pieces, like for clarinet, cello, and bass, used a lot of that where I had symmetrical intervals. And an orchestral piece that I composed was based on symmetrical intervals, coming from a center, but expanded. And, it was very thick writing, but that toned down was a good language. The real first piece that I wrote for the harp was when Natalie was actually in the hospital and our relationship was just getting started. We had met in Oakland Symphony and I couldn't help but be interested. Anyway, so she had to go in for an operation, but she left her harp in my house where I was staying. And so I decided, well, I'm going to learn the Bach Prelude in C and, expand my idea of what it means to play the harp. And at that same time, I was committed to writing my first composition, something important. This is before the flute and harp sonata. So I took 2 Bulgarian pieces, from a book, a collection, and kind of rewrote them, expanded them, used the rhetoric from those pieces, and wrote a solo harp piece. And it went through a lot of different keys, and it was, once again, not just drone-oriented or sitting in one place. I was still in my contemporary music phase, where complexity was always important. Something different was important. But having said that, Natalie introduced me to Celtic music, that whole world, which in its simplicity and beauty was extremely inspiring, and introducing me to the music of O'Carolan, which, who doesn't have a love affair with O'Carolan? It's so lyrical. I mean, out of his, 200 or 400 pieces, even if 100 of them are miraculous, that's a lot of music that's stimulating. And I do, in fact, have a book I made of transcriptions just for harp, preferably pedal harp, but it does work on lever harp. And I try to take pieces that are lesser known from the book that everybody knows, the collection of O'Carolan. There's some pieces that obviously have errors, or the person who went around copying his music was probably drunk at the time and made a lot of mistakes. So I went about thinking, well, what would O'Carolan want this to be? And how do you fix this? And here's a piece like, let's say, the elevation. When you look at it, there's 3/4 bar measures in a 4/4 piece. And a lot of it is kind of oddly strewn together and chaotic. It doesn't seem to make sense. But if you fix it up, take a look at it if you buy the book. It's very interesting. I'd love to hear any human being play it. And other pieces which needed just some tinkering to give it a little bit more backbone. You know, the arranging world is just filled with one's personal growth of how much you're going to be literal to the source, how much permission do you give yourself to go beyond it, and why, and what are the rules and laws that you personally follow. What will you allow yourself to do? Said, no, this is not me. I don't want to be chaotic. I'm not a harpist either. I mean, I like that language. You know, there's a lot of arrangements I do that are for weddings. You know, we have a lot of pop tunes, and I'm not against that, but it's not who I am as a composer.
Fantastic. And I love how you say it's a constantly discovering what your art form is, because I've experienced that too. And it's still growing. Every one of us is doing new things with our arranging and composing and finding what works. That's great. Fantastic. Yeah. So how has Natalie's influence come into how you arrange now? Because obviously her harp was one of the first things where you started to mess with the Bach prelude, but then how has that influenced you as the years have gone by?
Boy, just discovering the harp is a universe unto itself, and the sonorities available. I love that it's not a piano. The thing about the cello and piano repertoire is the piano is so bombastic, and you're always playing with this muscle kind of playing, which gets very tiring. And quite honestly, as the decades went by in my life, aesthetically, I liked that a lot less. Even though as an orchestral musician, you know, we did Rachmaninoff and Tchaikovsky and all this big stuff, that type of playing. And, you know, I appreciated it, and I needed to be able to do it. But the aesthetics change, and certainly now as an elder player, I love playing more in the whisper zone and not screaming all the time. And harp allows so much more space and light to come through. However, down to, you know, just hearing her play when she was, you know, growing as well as a musician, she was into learning very difficult parts, contemporary music, all these things, the Debussy dances. And so I arranged for her abilities that were to do all that. The older we got, it's not so much that the technique wasn't there, but the ideals change. We can make an impression by playing something simpler, easier, with just enough. Less is more. And why is it when it's not cluttered? For example, the Liszt Consolation, everybody knows it, lovely piece, but there's a lot of double stops in the right hand in the melody, and I don't want to play those on the cello. And as function goes, the cello should do it. And if the harp adds it, it's clutter to the fact that you have this beautiful, I don't even want to say accompanying part, you have this river of sound, this waterfall of sound, and you don't want to mess it up by saying, I can do this because I have the technical ability. Sometimes I've decided, no, and it takes me sometimes a decade to realize you just don't need that to make the right effect, to speak the truth of the music. So less truly is more is a very vital part. On another technical level with the harp, I've discovered, like when I talk to composers, how to write for the harp, I say, think of 2 left hands with 4 fingers playing one idea. So you're not doing piano where you're doing an accompaniment and a melody, which you can do. It sounds great when you do it. I love it. But for the most part, when you're a composer, you know, you need 4 fingers and you need your thumbs both on this side. So it's not like a piano. It's like that. 4 fingers, 2 left hands, one playing one idea.
That's a great way to describe it.
Thank you.
So has then the Celtic music influenced how you're writing nowadays? So I know you have a beautiful arrangement of, for instance, the Skyboat song. And that's gorgeous. It's open, a little bit simpler. And so is that representative of your new style?
Let's see. I did that, I think, in the 90s. So it goes back. It's a lovely piece, you know, and there's a lot of other pieces like it. O'Carolan repeats himself, but that was my favorite. And it surprises me that it was not other people's favorites. Nevertheless, at a convention we were at in San Jose, I was looking at somebody else's version of Kitty McGinnis. And, not to cast aspersions, but I thought, this is chaotic. It made no harmonic sense. It was trying to be something just out there and different. I fussed with that arrangement for a long time, many, many years, going back to it. The key that unlocked it for me was seeing it as a saraband from the Baroque, where the middle beat, yada dee 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. That's what made the harmonic scheme come alive, and it gave it some backbone. Even though it's not always obvious that you're accenting the second beat, it was harmonically present throughout. And things like that were very important to me. Always let the harmony in an arrangement tell a story. So the use of gratuitously groovy minor chords or this and that, which sometimes they work, I do it myself, but not all the time. There has to be a reason for why there's a chord there. Does it come up again? I'm a very classically minded player. And not so much from training, but from, my experience of playing other people's music. And that's how you learn the most.
So with your composing, how do you choose what pieces to arrange? For instance, the Botticelli pictures. Yes. How did you go about and say, that's the piece I'm going to do? Why will this work with this specific group of instruments?
Right. Mostly what I love about old music, classical music, is that pieces that transcend when they were written, transcend time. Like if you hear something by, let's say, Joachim Raff or somebody, and it sounds like it only sounded good when he wrote it, in the 19th century. But to play it today, it's like we just don't need that. So I'm always looking for something, not the most popular pieces in the world, but pieces that have that type of strength to say, this works in today's frame of mind. Now, of course, mostly the pieces I chose were things I played or listened to, the records I listened to or played in orchestra. And I did play the Respighi and loved it. And I saw there's a harp part in here, a real one, not just a makeshift one. The other movements are very difficult, but there is a natural harp part. And Venus works the best, which is why you're playing it, because, he did use harp. And that usually is very helpful when the composer themselves wrote a harp part. And I often look for that. So it's the beginning. One thing about some of these arrangements that are difficult was that they were greatly helped by my being there, because I studied the score and know it so well that when the three of us are there rehearsing, if there's any questions, I'm there to answer them. This needs to be played like this, even though it looks like this in the music. And that is an issue quite often that I get concerned with other people when handing it out. But I say, people are going to do what they're going to do. I have heard some recordings of my Reverie arrangement, which I'm very pleased that a lot of people have been using it. And more or less that plays itself. It's not a problem. Yes, the Respighi was a natural with a natural harp part. But I think the first time I looked for something like that was when I arranged the Afternoon of a Faun, which of course does have a real harp part. And the first time I arranged it for trio, I did it from a flute and piano reduction. And it was just terrible, because the piano part was makeshift and took allowances because it just can't do what it's going to do. But finally, after saying this won't do, I bought the orchestral score, which is the only way to do it. You have to look at all the parts. It's kind of like almost an operatic adventure. Like the cello is the voice of this type of part. The flute is going to be obviously probably the most prominent part because it's the voice. But the harp, there's a lot of things it can do that give you this background, the whole stage. And there's ways to use it, even though it wasn't originally written that way. That was, I think, my first foray into thinking in function. How does the harp function the best? How does the cello function the best? Don't do it just to force somebody else to get a solo here and there. But I do, of course, try to find music that does give everybody something rich and beautiful to do.
Well, that's fascinating. And what projects are you working currently on?
There's a piece from, I don't know if you're familiar with it, from the Robertsbridge Codex in the London Library. And it's from mid-14th century, probably circa 1360, and it's the earliest known piece written for keyboard instrument. My sources were in some medieval books, and they copyright their version. But I'm even looking at their version, and there's mistakes all over the place. And now, I did not go to the British Library. I wish I had to look at the original. But there are facsimiles, and it's so muddy and hard to read. It's obvious that people are misconstruing things all over the place. That could be this or that. And I've listened to maybe 20 different recordings where people do it a different way. For example, it's supposedly in a stompy form where you have an open and closed ending. So you play A, this ending, repeat A with a different ending. Very cool. I love that. However, some people left that out because it makes the piece too long. And I agreed with that. So I combined those two endings and made one, but gave it its own development. I'm even using Indian music techniques for that development. There's a technique called Tihai, where you repeat a passage 3 times that ends on sum, ends on the downbeat. And so I've gone way off the page of what the medieval police will allow me to do. And of course, this is also for 2 non-specific instruments. In fact, it is for keyboard. And I wanted it to be for 2 flutes, but I wanted a harp part to play with this. So I wound up writing an entire introduction, which is original composition, based on the rhetoric and the harmony, the parallel fifths. It's loaded with parallel fifths, which is, in a way, very groovy, very contemporary sounding. And I love that. Who doesn't love that? It's a real popular hit. If you check this piece out, it's quite amazing. You would never believe it was written in the 14th century, quite honestly. So I'm just finishing that up. And for years, I wanted it to be for 2 flutes and harp. I only actually wrote the harp improvisation within the last year. And only yesterday, I decided to make it for flute, harp, and viola, thinking, why not? The viola works well. I mean, I can't play it on the cello, but I don't want to play that high. That's like trying to prove something, and it's not right. In the rehearsals, I'll play it with them, and I'm hoping that if I go into a recording studio, if I'm in an isolation booth, maybe they can AI make me sound an octave higher, and I'll tell them I'm playing viola.
Wow, so that sounds like a fun project.
It's exciting. Actually, I would love to just have Natalie come in and say hello, because she is my partner for life, and we've been through a long history of learning how to be a couple, how to communicate, all these wonderful things, and making music together. This is my better half.
Fantastic. Wonderful to see you, Natalie.
Good to see you, Gretchen. This was a wonderful opportunity to share. Thank you.
Thank you to you both for sharing your musical journeys and making music available to the rest of us in the harp community that's so gorgeous and so beautiful. Your composing insights and stories have been so fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank y'all. Dan's music is available on Melodies at folkharp.com. See the links in the description. To close, we have another recording, a transcription for flute, harp, and cello of The Birth of Venus from 3 Botticelli Pictures by Respighi. Thank you for listening today. If you liked this episode, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this. Share the Melody Makers podcast with your family, friends, and any symphony musicians you know. On behalf of Melody's Traditional Music and Afghan Press Music for the Harp, this is Gretchen Monson wishing you a joyful, music-filled day.